Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back Dork Sahagian.
Hi there, welcome back. We've had an amazing day already in this Earth-covering centennial session, starting with identifying some problems and solutions. We learned about water, climate, security. We heard from our young scholars who are indeed the future of our science. Now we're going to see about what could be done to keep the planet habitable in a way that we would like it. Care and feeding of the planet Earth. Our first speaker to kick off this session is Margaret Leinen, current Director of Scripps. You might know her formerly as NSF Assistant Director of Geoscience, or you might know her as a former Vice Chair of the International Geosphere Biosphere Program, or maybe you just know her as a past President of AGU. To list her accomplishments would take all of her talk time, so I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'll just give you Margaret Leinen.
Thanks, Dork. So I just returned from Madrid, where I spent last week at the Conference of the Parties for Climate Change. And at that, this was the kickoff session, and standing two people to the right of the woman in the white dress there is Secretary General Guterres of the UN, who told us to get busy because we were in danger of sleepwalking past a point of no return. And while that started the meeting off with certainly a challenge to everybody, this meeting was totally focused on how to achieve the goal, the ambitious goal that came out of the Paris Agreement for reaching stabilization of climate at 1.5 degrees C of temperature increase rather than 2 degrees. That 2-degree number came out of earlier conferences, and it wasn't a scientific number, it was a political number. That's what we could agree as politicians we should achieve. But we've gotten past that, and if I can get the next slide, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how we can protect the habitability of the planet with respect to climate change and what the implications of that 1.5 degree challenge is. And we had the IPCC special report on achieving 1.5 degrees stabilization come out this past year. And the picture that's up there is of California wildfire with attempts to contain that wildfire. Wildfires are now 4 times more common in California than they were 3 decades ago as a result of the warming and the drying of California climate. So I just want to put this in the framework, here we are in California, that focuses on that. So I want to start by sort of unpacking a bit this idea of why was this ambitious agenda of 1.5 degrees selected. And what you have up here is what in the climate negotiations world is called the burning embers diagram. And what it is a number of areas of risk, like extreme weather events, large-scale singular events, unique and threatened systems, and then for each, the degree of risk to that area with increasing temperature. The gray bar across the sort of middle bottom is where we are now. The black line is 1.5 degrees C of temperature increase, and the red line is 2 degrees. And as you can see, on the left-hand side, unique and threatened ecosystems are already experiencing moderate to high levels of risk or they would be experiencing moderate to high levels of risk even with 1.5 degrees C. So this is the reason that the Paris Agreement agreed that we had to aim lower, we had to be more ambitious to focus on 1.5 degrees to ensure a habitable planet. So I'm going to show you that in view of a couple of risks, and this is sea level rise induced storm flooding in Southern California last January. And across there are a number of different kinds of risk, and I've highlighted with those two red diamonds warm water coral ecosystems, which we've heard a lot about, and coastal flooding, which we've heard a lot about with sea level rise. And you can see that both of them, even at today's degree of warming, which is about a degree over pre-industrial times, these ecosystems and these features are experiencing very high levels of risk. That means we're experiencing very high levels of risk. And even at keeping climate at 1.5 degrees of temperature increase, you can see across the board that many areas or many sectors like small-scale fishing, the Arctic, et cetera, are up for high levels of risk associated with climate change. So this is a real issue and a real problem. One of the pieces that is involved with this is certainly the reduction of emissions, and much of our discussion is focused on reducing emissions. But there's a deeper, more profound problem. The pathways limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees C with no or limited overshoot would certainly require very vast changes to our energy economy, to our use of land, to urban infrastructure, and so forth. And these systems the transitions are unprecedented in our past. And I have two photos up here to sort of remind you that, how difficult this is. The top one is, of course, the French Yellow Vest movement. That started in response to a fossil fuel tax that was imposed as part of France's nationally determined contribution to raise or to meet the 1.5 degree emissions level. The bottom is the recent unrest in Chile that actually caused the Conference of the Parties to be moved from Chile to Madrid, which was started in response to a small increase in transportation fares, which was part of Chile's nationally determined contribution to reach the 1.5 degree goals. So this is very hard work. We can say all we want about how we're going to get there, but combining where we should be with political and social science action is tough. And that's what the countries are struggling with. The second point I wanted to make was that all of the pathways that limit global warming to 1.5 degrees C project the use of carbon dioxide removal, not emissions reduction, CO2 removal from the atmosphere on the order of 100 to 1,000 gigatons of CO2 over the 21st century. And this would be used to compensate for residual emissions and overshoot. And this deployment is subject to multiple feasibility and sustainability constraints. What are carbon dioxide removal mechanisms? It's this list, certainly afforestation, reforestation, but bioenergy with carbon capture, direct air carbon capture, enhanced weathering, ocean alkaline, I can't do it. You can read it. This is all the business of AGU science. These are scientific areas where we have to step up to the plate because none of these are proven technologies. And all of them, if they were deployed at scales that were large enough to remove that amount of CO2, would have very significant impacts on land, energy, water, or nutrients. For example, afforestation would compete with other uses of land. So the scientific basis for this lies squarely with us, and it's time for us to step up to address this. I was really disheartened yesterday to be in a session in which this was being discussed and have a question come up, why are you doing this? This is counter to what we should be doing. We should just remove emissions. This is a slippery slope to people resting on CO2 removal rather than the hard work of emissions reduction. The truth is, as IPCC has shown us, we have to do both. That's our work to do the science. We need to start speaking out for the funding to be able to do it because it's not cheap and can't be done solely in the laboratory. But I am still optimistic about this because I have seen what this community has done in terms of looking at impacts, adaptation, and attribution. And it's time for us to step up with this problem as well, and I'm sure we're going to be able to.
Ladies and gentlemen, Bob Hazen.
I'm a mineralogist. I can't begin to suggest how we should best approach the care and feeding of our world. But I can say that if we're going to understand and predict this uncertain future, we have to understand in great detail the dynamic, changeable history of our planet. And to do that, there is no better testimony of change than minerals and the rocks in which they reside. And so what I'd like to do is take you on a journey that looks at how mineralogy is now constituted and not capable, I think, of helping us in this quest to understand our future. I want to make the brief point that minerals and life have co-evolved. I want to look at a new system of mineralogy which is based on data-rich attributes of mineralogy, and this is absolutely essential if we're going to understand the evolution and the change of the planet. And I'm going to give you one example related to life's origin. So, minerals and life have co-evolved. Minerals played key roles in the origin of life. We had the Great Oxidation event, which led to the rise of thousands of new mineral species that never existed before. The terrestrial biosphere created similar changes. And now humans are perhaps the greatest punctuation event in the history of mineral evolution because we're creating so many new types of phases and rearranging the phases that exist in Earth's crust. So, I think that that's clear. Minerals and life have co-evolved. However, the way mineralogists describe their field is ill-suited to understanding the evolution of a planet. Part of this is the reason we define minerals as a naturally occurring material with an idealized end-member composition and an idealized crystal structure. And there are about 5,500 different kinds of combinations of crystal structure and composition. But none of those actually exist on the planet because Earth is not ideal. Instead, minerals are incredibly information-rich. They have solid and fluid inclusions. They have interesting sizes and shapes. They have structural defects. They have trace elements, zoning. They have isotopes. They have all these different information-rich aspects which tell us the history of our planet, which give us that key information that we need if we're going to predict the future. So we are proposing a new kind of classification that leads to an understanding of Earth and planetary evolution. We're going to define minerals not based on the minimum amount of information, as the International Mineralogical Association does, but rather on the maximum possible amount of information. In this case, some IMA species are going to be split into many different natural kinds, others are going to be lumped, and we're going to start recognizing some of the very important planetary materials, amorphous phases, that are just not considered because they don't diffract X-rays. Okay, let me give you an example of how we split. Hydroxylapatite. The first hydroxylapatites was one of the very first alteration minerals in the most primitive meteorites. That's a very different kind of apatite than the big crystals you find in pegmatites or the hydroxyl apatite that's in all of our teeth and bones. I contend that if you're interested in planetary evolution, these are very different things, and you have to treat them as different in a classification system. By the same token, you have some minerals which have been split needlessly. There are 37 different formal species of tourmaline. One of these crystals with a beautiful zoning may have 3 or 4 different species in a single crystal. Even down at the millimeter scale, we have individual tourmaline grains that have 2 different species coexisting. That's just silly. And then there's amorphous materials, things like volcanic glasses and coal, other amorphous materials that just simply aren't cataloged because they don't diffract X-rays, and therefore you can't define their structure in the same way. And this is a problem for planetary exploration. On Mars, as much as 50% of many Martian soils are amorphous materials, which we simply look at and say, well, that's amorphous materials. But that's telling us something about the planet. So we are proposing a new system of mineralogy, and you'll see why this is important for understanding the future of our world. The earliest stage is minerals formed in stars, in stardust. But there are different kinds of stars that give very different isotopic compositions. So we might have AGB stars creating moissanite. We might have type 2 supernovas creating graphite. And we can show this in a graphical way. And again, you'll see how this becomes very important as we're trying to understand planetary evolution. In this case, there are 2 different kinds of nodes in this network graph. Some of the nodes indicate the places where minerals are formed, different kinds of stars, for example. Some of the nodes show the individual minerals. Those are the smaller nodes here. Every star is linked to several different minerals. Every mineral is linked to 1 or more stars. Those are the different kinds of minerals that we think about. We expand this as we go on and think about interstellar and nebular mineralogy. So we can expand the diagram, adding a new form of mineral processing. That's the high temperature condensation in the nebulas that are creating planets. We can look at interstellar medium and have yet more new minerals. In this case, ice is formed at very, very cold temperatures. We can keep expanding this diagram. Now this is the early planetesimals. And instead of the primary condensates, what we see now are all sorts of minerals that form through aqueous alteration, through impact processes, through thermal alteration, and so forth. So this is how far we've come. In the next 2 years, what we want to do is have all 5,500 mineral species that are recognized in a diagram that's maybe 10 times or 20 times the size of the one you see here. And we'll be able to take that diagram and be able to say, show us all the uranium minerals or the carbon minerals. Show us all the minerals that formed more than 2.5 billion years ago or more recently. Show us the minerals on Mars or Moon so that we can compare what makes Earth special. How is it different? This is the future of mineralogy, and this is the future that will allow us to describe how planets change through time. I want to give you one example of why this kind of thinking is important. And it has to do with the origin of life billions of years ago. So many, many people have suggested that minerals played key roles in the origin of life as scaffolds, as catalysts, as templates, as various ways of reacting on the surfaces or protecting minerals. And the question we have to ask is, which kinds of minerals played these roles? And what are the natural kinds in an evolutionary context? Now, some years ago, I made a list of all the IMA-approved minerals that I thought were going to be on an early planet. And I said that sulfide minerals are okay, and clay minerals, calcite, and some others were fine. But my friends wanted to use borate minerals, and I said, no, you can't have those. My friends said they wanted to have molybdates. And I guess, once again, in the early part of Earth history, we saw no way that those minerals could have formed. And so I said, you can't have them, and they were sad. But I was wrong in a way. Now, probably there weren't molybdenum minerals and boron minerals per se, but that's irrelevant because there was molybdenum and there was boron as trace elements and minor elements because all minerals are imperfect. They're not the idealized end members that we were thinking about. So the error lies in this definition, the current definition of species. We need a much broader definition to say what kind of minerals were present at the origin of life. Just like if we find pyrite on Mars, well, your first question is to be, well, what kind of pyrite is it? Because that's the thing that tells us. Because minerals incorporate all the different trace and minor elements. So if you have an early surface environment, you have every conceivable reactive surface site that you would need for the origin of life. And it's this same kind of thinking that applies as we look forward to the role of minerals in understanding the transitions that Earth has gone through, how it changes, and how we might predict the future, perhaps even helping us understand the care and feeding of planet Earth. So with that, my conclusions: minerals and life have co-evolved. This new evolutionary system is absolutely essential if we're going to understand the changes of planet and to understand our future, and that minerals play those key roles in the origin of life. But life's origins were in no way restricted by the fact that there were missing mineral species. So with that, I thank you very much, and I look forward to the rest of our panelists.
And go, please. Ladies and gentlemen, Eric Davidson.
I'm going to be speaking about the feeding part of care and feeding of a habitable planet, and particularly the feeding of the 7.5 billion, probably 10 to 12 billion by the end of this century, human inhabitants of the planet. As a consequence of that feeding, because most of us tend to like to eat animal products, a lot of manure happens, both literally and figuratively, in terms of the unintended consequences of these agricultural processes. In order to grow that much food, we have transformed the nitrogen cycle, introducing as much or more nitrogen in the form of fertilizer and biological nitrogen fixation from crops than is normally mobilized through natural processes of biological nitrogen fixation in terrestrial systems. And if we include in the ocean, in essence, we've essentially doubled the amount of reactive nitrogen. There's also some coming from combustion, and that's actually going to be a good news story that I'm going to get to in a little bit later. But it's important to note that about 80% of this nitrogen that's harvested from our global crop system and pasture production is used for feeding livestock. So if we all became vegetarians, which I'm not advocating and it's not very likely to happen, this problem would be much, much smaller. But it's quite astounding to me that 80% of that nitrogen is going to feed crops, to produce crops that we feed to animals, and we eat the animal products. The reason that's a problem is that these processes are an inherently leaky process. So we can think of it as a metaphor of nitrogen flowing through a pipe. You put in from the left-hand side the fertilizers, the manures, the nitrogen fixation, and we produce crops, and then we feed most of those crops to animals, and then from that we consume animal products, and we consume some crop products. But in the process, these pipes are very leaky, and they produce pollutants. At least when they enter the atmosphere, most of them are pollutants and have effects that we don't want. They're unintended consequences, both in the atmosphere and in groundwaters and surface waters. Now, the good news is that because of our ability to produce nitrogen fertilizers, humankind is better nourished now on average than at any time in human history. We still have about 800 million people who are malnourished, so it's not evenly distributed. But the percentage that are malnourished has gone down. But then we have another problem. There's another 800 million people or so who are overnourished. And also our ecosystems, just as people can become overnourished, our ecosystems are overnourished with that excess nitrogen, causing eutrophication of estuaries, contaminating our drinking water with nitrate, polluting the atmosphere with particulate matter and ozone that are known human health hazards, respiratory hazards, creating nitrous oxide, a potent greenhouse gas and destroyer of stratospheric ozone, and then deposition of nitrogen in rain and dry deposition, which affects the biodiversity of the ecosystems that receive those. Now, if I had a sign like this out in a crop field, acknowledging that because of this technology, we have a very efficient system where one farmer can feed most all of us here, giving us the opportunity to come here and be endeavored with other activities. But fortunately, because of PowerPoint, I do have a sign like that. And the message I would like to give is MoFo low po. We need more food with low pollution. And that's our challenge, is to figure out how to do that. Now, as I said, there have been some good news stories with reducing combustion sources of nitrogen. On the left, you see how NOI, or oxidized forms of nitrogen, have decreased from the early 2000s up to the present. That's thanks to the Clean Air Act amendments that were passed in a bipartisan manner under President George H.W. Bush in the 90s. And so we've made great progress. There's still some areas that are haven't made as much progress as we need. But on the right-hand side, you see that ammonia emissions, which were not covered by that legislation, have actually grown. And in fact, in the United States, ammonia emissions, as is most of agriculture, is largely unregulated. Well, we can also look at the historical pattern of many countries, and the United States one of them. It's a little bit of a complicated graph. On the y-axis, we have nitrogen use efficiency, which is the ratio of the nitrogen that's going into our harvested product divided by the amount of inputs. And on the x-axis is yield. Well, we want yield to go up because we have more people to feed and we want them to be nourished. We want to use our nitrogen as efficiently as possible. In some cases, as you can see for that line for Malawi, back in the 1960s, they were actually mining soil, taking more out from the soil than they were putting back in. But now with fertilizers used as much as we are, in general, historically, from the 60s onward in most countries, that efficiency went down as yield went up. But in this, you can see in the United States and in France, something changed along about the 80s and 90s, and we started using that nitrogen more efficiently. There's a number of different reasons, crop varieties, different technologies. And so we've increased yield and also increased efficiency. Now, quickly, if we had to produce enough food to feed the world in 2050, according to some FAO projections, on average, we'd have to have this yield of nearly 100 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year removed. And we wouldn't want more than about 40 kilograms per hectare per year as what we call nitrogen surplus, which is the input minus the harvest. That's what we need to maintain a safe operating space where we're not putting too much of that nitrogen into the atmosphere or into the water and into the aquatic ecosystems. So where we really want to be is up in that upper right-hand corner. But as you can see, none of the countries of the world are there. Some of us are going that direction, but on the other hand, there are countries like China that are moving down to the lower right side, which is that nitrogen surplus being shown there. Recently, they've started to flatten out that curve. Now, what can we do about that? I'd like to draw your attention to the work of a colleague of mine, and this is a plug for her talk tomorrow, where we're working on something we call the Sustainable Agriculture Matrix. Because people have to be part of the problem, solution, excuse me. We are part of the problem. We have to be part of the solution. And to do that, we have to figure out ways to motivate people. So it's not just an issue of the biology or the geophysics. We have to think about how this integrates with the economy and with the environment. So we've put together these indices. Nitrogen is only one of them, as you can see here. The purpose of this is to provide consistent and transparent measurements for country performance, to integrate socioeconomic and ecological synergies, understand their trade-offs, and to quantify and provide a visual way of seeing how we're doing, how we're making progress. So this is an early product. On the left is red, on the right is green. That's where you want to be. Those here are a whole bunch of different indicators. I don't have time to go into them, but nitrogen is one of many. And you can see that over time, we've plotted how the United States has gone. Some of them are going in the right direction, some of them are going in the wrong direction. This is like bringing home a report card and showing it to your parents. And you can say, well, am I doing better than last semester or worse? And we can do that for all of the countries in the world for which we can obtain data. We have to aggregate a lot of information. We have an imperfect set of indicators in many cases. But it is a visual that allows us to look at how we compare ourselves with our neighbors and how we compare ourselves with our track record over the last few years. So thank you very much for your attention.
And now, Lisa Grumlett.
Never before in my career has climate change and planet habitability been so elevated in the mind of the public. I suspect every one of you knows what I'm talking about. You're a scientist. You study the Earth. Your friends, your family, your neighbors look you in the eye and they say some version of this question: are we doomed? Now, in those first seconds, after they ask that question, they watch your facial expressions. They read your body language. They look for glimmers of hope or harbingers of doom. And like it or not, before we even open our mouths, we are bellwethers of the human condition. Some of us try to duck the big question by sharing the latest science in detail, emphasizing rigor, talking about consensus, acknowledging uncertainty. And after we get through that, most likely the question will come back to us as, what do you think? Will the planet be habitable for my children? And look it, there's no right answer. But I challenge each of us to have a plan as to what we are going to say and how we will address this big question about planet habitability. So here we go. Let's take a quick spin at a little bit of science as we think about that question. Okay, what does the research say? What are the indicators that humans have fundamentally changed the habitability of our planet? So it's been 10 years now since Johan Rockström led a group of internationally renowned scientists to define planetary boundaries, essentially a dashboard for the planet. And that group defined 9 composite variables that track the trajectory of the Earth as a system as influenced by human actions. Recall, this was 10 years ago, and the goal was to communicate how transgressing one or more of the planetary boundaries could be catastrophic due to the risk of crossing thresholds that will trigger nonlinear, abrupt environmental change at a planetary scale. Some of those indicators stayed in the green. We're always very happy to see stratospheric ozone depletion as an example of a place where we have had success. 4 of the 9 planetary boundaries are in the orange or red zones, indicating a trajectory of irreversible change: climate change, biodiversity, land use change, and as Eric has so well described, the nitrogen cycle. But what does the real world look like? Most recently, Tim Layton and his colleagues built on the IPCC analyses that Margaret described just a few minutes ago to report on the looming tipping points in the Earth system. That is when a small change in forcing triggers a strongly nonlinear response in the internal dynamics of the climate system, qualitatively changing its future state. And as we know, and we've been hearing about at this meeting, we have moved from hypothetical to the real world in this area. Tipping points are starting to be observed and discussed by us as scientists. So to just take one example, we are seeing that Arctic sea ice loss is amplifying regional warming, and Arctic warming, together with Greenland melting, are driving an influx of fresh water into the North Atlantic. This contributes to a slowdown of the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, AMOC to the insiders, a key part of the global heat and salt transport by the ocean. Rapid melting of the Greenland ice sheet and further slowdown of the AMOC could destabilize the West African monsoon, triggering droughts in the Africa's Sahel region. That's just one. They are big, they are nonlinear, and they are connected. So are we doomed? These tipping point projections have been widely reported in the press. They have been amplified in social media. This is the science that is fueling the climate strikes, the call for a Green New Deal. This is creating the sense of urgency in the public. And you find yourself being asked by your friends, what do you think? And there's two reasons why you're being asked. One is you know stuff. You have credibility based on the fact that you are earth scientists. But the second thing we know is that when people are looking for credible answers, they look for two things: people that know things and people like them. Your friends and family are turning to you because you are connected to them. That is incredibly important. So I'm not going to tell you what you should say, but we do have, for me, some reasons for hope. And I want to point out that some of our fellow AGU members have done us a huge favor in producing a global assessment of practices and technologies that are already in hand, or very nearly so, to address climate change and planetary habitability. I'm referring to Project Drawdown. These solutions range from buildings and cities to ecosystems and food, from electricity to materials and transport, to carbon sequestration as well as mitigation of emissions. There are no silver bullets, but there are actions that every individual and every institution on the planet can take. There's a little advertisement for John Foley's talk, in just another hour, in which he'll be talking about this. Okay, for me, I am always inspired by the words of Katharine Hayhoe, the winner of the AGU Climate Communication Prize in 2014. Recall her admonition to just start talking about climate. We need to find common ground, shared values and aspirations with those friends and families that are asking us, are we doomed? So this is kind of cracking me up. Why am I showing a picture of a Ford Mustang at an AGU talk? There's a reason. I'm going to tell you about how I start this conversation with my own extended family. I grew up outside of Detroit. I'm the daughter of an electrical engineer. We were super proud when my father was part of the team that launched the first Mustang sports car at the New York World's Fair in 1964. It is a part of my family's legacy and pride. So in the last couple months, Detroit's stepping up here. They have an electric SUV. People from Detroit are really proud of that. And this, for me, starts a conversation. It's going to go into more difficult areas, but it starts a conversation that is based on trust and based on a common humanity with my extended family. So in all seriousness, it's time that we lead that conversation. We have to stop looking at our shoes when people ask us that hard question. It's time to talk about this outside the comfort of the AGU meeting. Let's do this. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Laurel Larson.
Good afternoon. Today I'll be providing a perspective on aquatic ecosystem restoration that works. But before I talk about that, I will acknowledge that there are many salient critiques of environmental restoration. Which one advances? Okay. Well, I'm pushing it and it's not going, so we'll see. Maybe it's the other one. There are many salient critiques of environmental restoration. Many of these critiques focus on the story of stream restoration. Stream restoration, and let me see if I can get this next slide. Is there anyone who could, okay, there we go. Thank you. Can we go back one, please? Okay. Stream restoration is a multi-billion-dollar industry that often prescribes a physical template or a structure that streams need to have in order to achieve a planform stability. Many times the design criteria are based on strict width to depth ratios, meander spacing, or the construction of step pool sequences using riprap or rock veins like you see here. Now, the challenge with this type of structural restoration is that often the structures may fail. And the reason for this is that restoration often does not address the root causes of impairment or flashy flows within the watershed. So a result is that often when we attempt to restore the structure, a natural system structure of a stream, we're not often restoring the natural system function. And in fact, many restored streams exhibit even impaired functionality compared to unrestored streams with respect to functions such as fine sediment trapping, denitrification, metabolism, and respiration. So one of the most salient critiques of restoration is that when we attempt to bring a system back to a former condition, in this case, a natural system stream structure, we do not often restore the natural system function. There are also ambiguities about to which previous condition we're restoring a landscape to. So many critics of environmental restoration take issue with the term restoration itself, but I would like to point out that there is actually another definition here that might be more appropriate and worth striving for, although I would change the verb here from restoration to re-engineering. Because often, in restoration projects that work, we need to re-engineer the system to novel conditions to achieve the desired improvement in functionality. One example that I'd like to highlight here is the case of the Everglades. The Everglades was formerly called the River of Grass by Marjorie Stoneman Douglas because it was a free-flowing landscape in which flows redistributed sediment among landscape elements, making possible the stability of this patterned landscape structure that you see behind me, the ridge and slough landscape, thought to be essential for fish and wildlife. Over the past 100 years or so, human actions have compartmentalized the system through the construction of levees and canals, and there's also been significant drainage. Now, the science team tasked with restoration decided that in this case, to achieve the functionality of sediment redistribution, it's best not to remove all of those barriers to flow. If we were to do that, there simply isn't enough water within the system at present to restore sediment redistribution, but rather the answer lies in retaining several of those barriers, enabling us to achieve a buildup of a head differential between different compartments, and then we can use that head differential to release pulsed flows that are sufficient to redistribute sediment. I'm not sure what's going on with the slides here. My apologies for that. So, designing that approach to restoration would not have been possible without an understanding of the system's past. And here I'd like to highlight the appropriateness of the AGU Centennial slogan. In the Everglades, analysis of pollen within sediment cores revealed that these ridges and sloughs were persistent landscape features over the scale of millennia. They weren't just degrading coincidentally over the past century. Archival work done by Chris McVoy and others has cultivated an understanding that the Everglades did have high historic flow velocities. At times there were even rapids on the Miami River like you see here on the right. And this was important in convincing scientists and managers that the types of flows needed to invoke sediment redistribution were indeed possible in the historic system. So sometimes, in contrast to the Everglades, restoring a historic landscape structure will be sufficient to restore historic functionality. And in this vignette, I'm bringing us back to the case of these incised streams on the East Coast. This is Big Spring Run in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And my colleagues Dorothy Meritz and Bob Walter analyzed the seeds found within the organic rich layer that you see at the bottom of the stream trench on the top photo. And that work revealed that historically, these landscapes were not characterized by single-threaded meandering streams like the type that we are often restoring to, based on these design criteria, but rather these landscapes were characterized by multi-threaded channels, low energy systems that had extensive interaction between the channel and the floodplain, and dense valley bottom wetlands. So this inspired a novel approach to stream restoration, and that approach was to remove the legacy sediment that had accumulated in these floodplains as a result of the history of mill damming in this area. And at Big Spring Run, that excavation of sediment was sufficient to expose historic seeps and springs. The channel that was designed here was designed to go over bank quite frequently, and as a result, the landscape today, about 9 years after the restoration has taken place, is characterized by a complex network of channels and extensive valley bottom wetlands. And results are now coming out, but they're suggesting that this landscape is quite effective at retaining sediment, nitrogen, and phosphorus. So I'd like to emphasize that knowing the history of the landscape here is important. A graduate student who's a historical ecologist who worked with me recently undertook a meta-analysis of the historical ecology literature and found that about a quarter of the studies that she reviewed inspired management recommendations that deviated from the status quo. So in the final time I have, I'd like to focus on the second part of this centennial slogan, which is inspiring the future. And I'd like to highlight that there are restoration projects taking place that are collaborative with natural system functions in order to improve functionality of the stream. One example is the use of beaver dam analogs in the West, such as in the Scott Valley in California. This involves the creation of artificial beaver dams, which encourages the stream to widen the incision trench, which in turn encourages deposition within the floodplain and a raising of the base level of the stream to the point when beavers can return and they will fortify their structures. And the result is that these landscapes are much more effective at retaining water, even to the point where ranchers who were once averse to the reintroduction of beavers are fully on board with this because their pastures stay greener for longer. So in conclusion, I will summarize some ideas on restoration that works. Restoration that works addresses the root cause of impairment, is collaborative with the dynamism of natural systems in space and time, emphasizes landscape function potentially but not necessarily as an outcome of structure, is grounded in and inspired by a historical perspective of the ecosystem, may create a novel ecosystem, and last, is compatible with resource use. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to wrap us up, Dorothy Merritt.
Thank you to all of our speakers. One round of applause, please, for all of them. You will note that there were glimmers of hope throughout, and we thank you for that. We have time for one question, we've been told. So from the audience, anybody who wants to raise your hand.
Dorothy, I'm so sorry, but we're running late. We can continue this conversation in our networking area beyond the blue wall over there.
Okay.
Please forgive us. We hope you'll all join us beyond the blue wall. Thank you very much.